Poor girl falls in love with the richest young man in the country, but he gets revenge on her, and the morning sun lit up the narrow streets of the neighborhood where Seo-yeon lived with Soon-ja. The houses were painted in colors worn down by time, and their facades reflected the simplicity of the residents. A faint aroma of freshly baked bread mixed with the scent of flowers from the florist's shop where Seo-yeon worked. She always woke up very early to tend to her ailing mother's needs before heading to her modest job. She prepared an herbal tea that Soon-ja drank in hopes of easing a pain that seemed to grow daily. With a gentle smile, Seo-yeon would lean in to touch her mother's forehead, checking her temperature and promising she would do everything possible to help her recover. Seo-yeon's finances were scarce. Most of her salary went toward medicine and medical care. Each time she left the house, she felt a tightness in her chest thinking about all the unpaid bills. Despite everything, she maintained an optimistic and hard-working attitude, ready to do anything for her mother. At 22, she had a simple, natural beauty, reflected in her hazel eyes and honest smile. Even so, worry was her constant companion, reminding her that time to treat Soon-ja's illness might run out if she failed to gather enough money for an expensive operation. That morning, Seo-yeon headed to the flower shop with her usual haste. She remembered she had to deliver a very important arrangement for a commemorative event honoring Min-jun's family, the owners of one of the most powerful construction companies in the country. While arranging the flowers in large vases, her boss informed her that the delivery had to be made to the construction company's main headquarters, where the ceremony for Don Manuel, the recently deceased patriarch, would take place. Seo-yeon was aware of the family's reputation, famous for their massive investments and luxurious events, but she didn't know the details of the environment she was about to enter. That day was also significant for Min-jun, the heir to the construction company. After the death of his father, Don Manuel, he found himself under tremendous pressure. His family and the shareholders demanded he take charge with a firm hand. At 28, Min-jun was a tall young man with an elegant bearing and a serious gaze. Until recently, he had lived a relatively carefree life, traveling and attending social events. However, his father's passing had changed his priorities, forcing him to face complex business matters. He felt a huge weight on his shoulders, trying to uphold his father's legacy and meet everyone's expectations. The commemorative ceremony in honor of Don Manuel was held in the company's main hall. Dark wooden panels covered the walls, and enormous windows allowed the morning light to enter. Chairs were arranged for the attendees, and at one end there was a portrait of Don Manuel in a gold frame, surrounded by flowers. It was there that the arrangement Seo-yeon had prepared was to be placed, an exquisite piece featuring white lilies, roses, and green foliage. Upon arriving, Seo-yeon felt somewhat intimidated by the display of elegance. Luxury cars at the entrance, men and women in immaculate suits. Still, she tried to appear confident so no one would notice her nervousness. When Seo-yeon stepped into the hall carrying the floral arrangement, an assistant greeted her and showed her where it should go. As she carefully positioned it, her hands trembled slightly. A murmur of conversation filled the room among the company executives, and the atmosphere was solemn. Then the mishap occurred. While she stepped back to admire the arrangement and make sure it matched the other decorations, Seo-yeon tripped on the edge of a rug and lost her balance. With a small, stifled cry, she fell against a nearby pedestal, scattering several papers on the floor and drawing everyone's attention. Amid the commotion, Min-jun, dressed in a black suit and gray tie, approached with a displeased expression. His day had already been filled with tensions, endless meetings, a stream of condolences, and the emotional weight of honoring his father's memory. Seeing the young woman on the floor with the scattered documents and the slightly tilted floral arrangement, he reacted with irritation. In a low yet harsh tone, he asked if she realized where she was and how important the event was. Completely mortified, Seo-yeon could only stammer an apology as she hurried to gather the papers and straighten the arrangement clumsily. The scene caught the attention of several guests, who looked over curiously. The sudden silence made Seo-yeon even more anxious, feeling her cheeks grow warm. Min-jun frowned and warned her to be more careful. His words were cold enough to wound anyone's feelings. Yet beneath that severe demeanor, there was a mix of fatigue and frustration that Seo-yeon perceived. She kept apologizing, looking anxiously at the wrinkled papers she was returning to Min-jun's hands. One of them contained sensitive financial reports. Min-jun checked it to ensure nothing important had been lost. The tension in the room was palpable, like a heavy weight in the air. Some executives whispered about the girl's lack of professionalism, while others looked on sympathetically at the obvious discomfort of the situation. Min-jun stood watching Seo-yeon, noticing her distressed expression and trembling hands. In a small gesture, he helped her adjust the arrangement that had been knocked askew. However, his posture remained distant. She then noticed his refined features and, at the same time, the rigid stance he held. It caught her attention how he averted his gaze, as if torn between maintaining his composure or saying something more conciliatory. When the family assistant signaled Seo-yeon to leave, she nodded almost inaudibly. She felt practically paralyzed by embarrassment. The event was about to begin, and she had caused a minor scene during a solemn moment. Before turning away, she glanced up at Min-jun and saw a flicker of unease in his eyes, as though he'd momentarily considered softening his words or apologizing for his brusque reaction. However, the tension left him no room to express it openly, and she departed feeling small, unable to justify her stumble in such an imposing place. As Seo-yeon walked away down the side corridor, the murmur among the attendees resumed, and the executives returned to discussing business matters and memories of Don Manuel. Min-jun, however, remained standing for a few seconds, looking toward the door through which Seo-yeon had exited. He felt a twinge of regret for having been so harsh with her, but he reminded himself that this was an extremely important event. There was no room for mistakes or distractions. He had to remain firm in front of everyone. Even so, something about the girl's eyes, about how she had carried the floral arrangement and her vulnerability, stayed with him. He couldn't explain why, but he had noticed a faint tremor in her voice and a genuine concern that didn't match the clumsiness of her fall. Back at the flower shop, Seo-yeon's boss noticed how dejected she looked and tried to console her, saying that sometimes rich people were too demanding. Seo-yeon sighed and nodded, trying to tell herself it had just been a bad moment and that she shouldn't let one mishap get her down. Yet her thoughts kept drifting to that final gesture from Min-jun, when, despite his anger, he had helped her straighten the floral piece. She thought she had seen a hint of concern on his face. She wasn't sure why, but she was surprised to find that there might have been more in his gaze than just hostility. Meanwhile, in the construction company's hall, Min-jun tried to focus on the memorial ceremony. He listened to the speeches honoring his father, the praise for Don Manuel's great work, and the legacy now passing into his hands. Still, the image of the young woman who had tripped kept coming to mind. He wondered who she was and why she looked so fragile. In an instant, he considered how different their lives were. He had grown up surrounded by luxury, never lacking anything essential, while the way Seo-yeon dressed and her expression suggested a simple life filled with struggles. Something about that contrast unexpectedly intrigued him. When the ceremony ended, Min-jun made his way to his office to look over some pending documents. His mother, Young-suk, accompanied him for a few minutes and told him that, despite the mourning, it was vital to stay level-headed in running the business. Min-jun nodded, already feeling tired from the day and burdened by his new responsibilities. Yet inwardly, the image of Seo-yeon remained. He tried to distract himself by signing papers and reviewing reports, but his mind kept drifting back to the scene of her falling and the tremble he saw in her eyes. A pang of guilt tugged at him for reprimanding her so harshly, though he couldn't explain why that minor incident mattered to him more than usual. As for Seo-yeon, after composing herself at the flower shop, she returned home. She climbed the stairs carefully so as not to disturb her mother, who was resting in the small living room that had been turned into a bedroom. Soon-ja greeted her affectionately, and Seo-yeon concealed her troubles so as not to upset her. She mentioned taking the flowers to the event and assured her everything had gone smoothly, leaving out the details of her stumble. With a gentle smile, Soon-ja asked about the elegant people who must have been there. Seo-yeon obliged, offering a brief description of lavish dresses and expensive suits, but kept her true feelings hidden. She didn't want her mother worrying about something that, hopefully, would have no further consequences. That night, Seo-yeon mentally reviewed the medical bills and thought about the need for a higher salary or a second job. She couldn't afford to give up. Soon-ja's health depended on her persistence. Elsewhere, Min-jun stayed late at the office, reorganizing the papers scattered during Seo-yeon's fall. As he placed each document back in its folder, he remembered her expression, her quiet voice, and the way she had stammered her apologies. He felt a pang of remorse for having been so severe, though he couldn't understand why that small event mattered more to him than usual. The next day, the city awoke to mild weather. Both worlds, the humble one of Seo-yeon and the privileged one of Min-jun, went on without intersecting. Yet each of them carried the after-effects of that brief encounter. Seo-yeon felt even more determined not to make mistakes that could jeopardize her chances of helping her mother, while Min-jun, plagued by sleepless nights, wondered if he would ever run into the girl who, with just one stumble, had managed to capture his interest in the midst of so many responsibilities. In the end, Seo-yeon left the memorial event feeling humiliated by Min-jun's reprimand. However, as she slipped away among the guests, he watched her with a tinge of guilt and a curiosity he couldn't fully understand. Although their worlds seemed at odds, that single mishap had left a lasting mark on both of them, a strange connection that would soon resurface in their lives. Early the next morning, Seo-yeon opened the florist's shop with her usual punctuality. She had slept little, unable to shake off the memory of what had happened at the construction company's ceremony. Even though there were only a few morning customers, she went about her tasks, tending to the plants and organizing bouquets for the small display window. As she prepared red roses and trimmed away wilted leaves, she recalled Min-jun's eyes, first angry, then doubtful, and finally marked by a curiosity she still didn't fully grasp. She tried to convince herself that this man had likely forgotten both the stumble and the reprimand, absorbed by his important affairs. Yet part of her continued thinking about him, intrigued by that fleeting connection she had sensed when he helped her pick up the fallen floral arrangement. Around midday, Seo-yeon went to place a sign on the door, advertising special offers on roses and carnations. She enjoyed writing creative messages to encourage people to buy flowers, but that day her inspiration seemed blocked by contradictory thoughts. The lingering shame still troubled her, yet it was mixed with a subtle feeling of anticipation. Just then, she heard the sound of a car pulling up in front of the shop. Through the glass, Seo-yeon made out the silhouette of a tall man in a sleek suit that clashed with the weathered facades of the neighborhood. Her heart skipped a beat the moment she recognized him, Min-jun stepping out of the vehicle and eyeing the shop with a hint of uncertainty. Seo-yeon didn't know how to react when he opened the door. His steps were sure, but his expression revealed a blend of determination and slight unease. Before she could utter a single word, Min-jun greeted her in a measured voice and introduced himself more formally, as though she had no idea who he was. Forcing a polite smile, Seo-yeon felt a knot in her stomach. She couldn't imagine why he would come to a place so modest compared to the opulence he was accustomed to. Min-jun explained that he wanted to order a special bouquet for a private event. His tone was meant to sound confident, but inwardly he kept questioning why he felt so out of place in this simple setting, filled with fresh scents and vibrant colors. After a brief silence, Min-jun lowered his voice and apologized for his behavior during Don Manuel's memorial. He admitted that his reaction had been influenced by the pressure of the moment and the nerves of organizing such an important event after his father's death. Seo-yeon listened, her gaze fixed on the flowers in her hands, trying to process the fact that he had gone out of his way to look for her in order to apologize. It was clear the subject wasn't easy for him. Min-jun was not someone who admitted mistakes lightly. Still, Seo-yeon sensed a genuine note in his voice. She decided to respond politely, playing down the incident and saying she understood the tension he must have been under. The tension between them eased somewhat. Unsure how to continue, Min-jun began to glance around the shop. He took in the shelves full of potted plants, small bags of fertilizer, and flowers and buckets of water. When his eyes drifted back to Seo-yeon, he noticed the fatigue etched on her forehead, signs that something beyond the recent mishap weighed on her day after day. When he asked how she had come to work there, Seo-yeon replied that the florists had provided a modest income for years, most of which went toward caring for her ailing mother. Though she usually kept her family story private, something in Min-jun's demeanor prompted her to open up, perhaps because he, too, had revealed a vulnerable side by confiding the pain of his father's passing. This initial conversation brought about their first genuine confidences. Min-jun mentioned how his life had completely changed since Don Manuel's death. At every turn, he felt the pressure to become the backbone of the family business. Before his father's passing, he'd barely been involved in the construction company's decisions. Now he was forced to lead meetings, sign contracts, deal with shareholders, and handle countless formalities that had never been part of his daily life. Seo-yeon sympathized with that feeling of burden, as in her own home, she faced the urgent medical needs of her mother, Soon-ja. She told him that the required medications were expensive and that hospital bills kept piling up with no clear path to pay them off. That mutual sense of responsibility became a thread connecting them. Despite coming from such different worlds, they discovered they shared a heavy family duty, each in their own way. The silence that followed these revelations was not awkward but rather contemplative. Minjun glanced toward the door, noticing that the afternoon light was now streaming in more intensely. He decided to lighten the mood by suggesting Seoyeon accompany him to a nearby market to choose the flowers for his special order. She hesitated for a moment, since the shop's schedule rarely allowed her to leave, but her boss encouraged her to go, excited about the prospect of a distinguished client making a big purchase that could help sales. With a grateful nod, Seoyeon agreed, and the two walked to the local market a few streets away. The contrast was obvious. Minjun's elegant suit and polished shoes stood out against food stalls, street vendors calling out their deals, and ordinary people buying fruits and vegetables. A spark of curiosity lit up his eyes as he observed this world so different from his own. He found it fascinating, even comforting, how people greeted and smiled at one another. Surprisingly, he felt at ease in the midst of the bustle, led by Seoyeon's calm voice as she guided him confidently among stands filled with roses, jasmines, and geraniums. While they browsed different flowers, Seoyeon offered her thoughts on which would withstand temperature changes best and which combinations would add a touch of elegance. Minjun listened intently, as if he were realizing for the first time that despite his life of luxury, there were countless simple things he knew nothing about. He felt oddly comfortable sharing this experience with her, as she named the plants and shared anecdotes from the florists. When they finished selecting a few varieties, they decided to rest on a wooden bench beneath tall trees in a nearby park. There, conversation flowed with surprising ease. It was then that a quiet spark of attraction emerged. They said nothing explicit about what they were starting to feel, but it was evident in their gestures and glances, in the way they smiled whenever their hands brushed as they looked over sketches for the bouquet. Though they came from different worlds, they shared snippets of personal memories, as though each had found in the other a sympathetic, open ear. Minjun spoke of how difficult it was to be without his father's guidance in making such critical decisions. Seoyeon understood him all too well. She lived in daily fear of losing her mother and being left unprotected. Meanwhile, far from the flowers and the informal settings Minjun was exploring, the atmosphere at the construction company was quite different. Na-yeon, Minjun's sister, and Sang-min, his paternal uncle, were holding a private meeting. They examined confidential documents, especially the company's financial statements and projections for upcoming contracts. Na-yeon showed her uncle some analyses pointing to the possibility of a merger that seemed advantageous for the family, yet included clauses that could benefit only a few and seriously harm the company's long-term stability. Sang-min, a man seasoned in shady dealings, recognized an opportunity to enrich themselves in those papers. With Minjun as the new leader, their maneuvers would be easier, knowing he was preoccupied with doubts and the responsibilities he had inherited. They exchanged conspiratorial smiles, thinking of the steps they would soon take, promising each other mutual cover while disregarding the transparent practices Don Manuel had advocated during his life. Back in the park, Seoyeon and Minjun parted ways as the sun began to sink. She thanked him for having taken the time to share that moment away from his usual luxury and pretense. He confessed he had enjoyed it, surprising himself with how much he had learned in that short walk through a world so far removed from his own. Before leaving, he asked when the special bouquet would be ready. Seoyeon, with a genuine smile, said it would be done in a couple of days, though she was waiting on a few more details to ensure it was perfect. At that moment, an exchange of glances made the air grow taut. Minjun gently squeezed Seoyeon's hand in thanks. He explained that his mother, Young-suk, had asked him to choose something meaningful in memory of Don Manuel, something unlike their usual floral arrangements. And he wanted to surprise her with a personal, unique creation. Seoyeon promised to do her utmost to design something worthy of his mother's request. As he walked away, she felt a mixture of shyness and delight. She didn't know whether to let hope take root or to guard herself from illusions. After all, he was a wealthy man, part of the nation's most influential family, while she was merely a florist's employee living in a humble neighborhood. Minjun climbed into his car with a tingling feeling in his chest. Part of him scolded himself for allowing a simple stroll and conversation with someone he barely knew to affect him so profoundly. Another part was grateful for the chance to reconnect with a simplicity he had long been missing. He drove off certain that he would see her again soon, and that their meeting wouldn't be limited to just one flower order. Something about Seo-yeon made him believe that beyond their social differences, he might find genuine companionship in her. Meanwhile, at the construction company's offices, Na-yeon and Sang-min continued reviewing spreadsheets and drafting proposals for a future merger. The gleam in their eyes betrayed an insatiable ambition, and each clause they discussed reinforced their plan to act behind Min-jun's back, capitalizing on any moment of distraction. When they finished the meeting, they shook hands, making no effort to hide their conspiratorial smiles, confident everything would unfold according to their designs. At dusk, Min-jun said goodbye to Seo-yeon outside the flower shop, showing an interest that went beyond a simple order. Even without explicit words, he invited her to keep in closer touch, and she, almost in a whisper, agreed that if he needed anything, he could find her there. He left, aware that a new dynamic was emerging between them, something neither dared call romance, yet it was present in every knowing look and each unspoken sentence. The day ended with Min-jun leaving the modest neighborhood, thinking of the market, the warmth of the people, and his closeness with Seo-yeon. He wanted to know more about her story, yes, but also that essence that seemed to grant her a quiet strength. The last thought crossing his mind was the need to see her again, perhaps even away from the flower shop, in a setting where they could talk without hurry or formalities. Meanwhile, in the dimly lit office, Na-yeon and Sang-min stacked up the documents that incriminated their plan, excited at the prospect of a merger that would yield them hefty profits. They prepared everything cautiously, aware that if Min-jun found out, he could put an immediate stop to it. They promised each other they would work stealthily until they achieved their goals, letting no one stand in their way. The week passed with the urgency only those facing serious problems truly understand. Seo-yeon spent her mornings tending the flower shop and keeping an eye on the phone, fearful of receiving news from the hospital treating Soon-ja. Her mother's condition had worsened in recent days. The pain came more frequently, and the medication provided barely any relief. One afternoon, after closing the shop, Seo-yeon went to the clinic to meet with the doctor overseeing the case. He explained that the surgery could not be postponed much longer. Soon-ja needed an expensive procedure, and every day's delay posed an additional risk. Worry clouded Seo-yeon's mind, and she had no idea where she would find the necessary funds. When she returned home, she found Soon-ja lying on the small couch that had become her makeshift bed. The mother noticed the tense expression on her daughter's face and tried to reassure her, insisting they would get through this as they always had. But Seo-yeon was painfully aware that the medical bills already far exceeded what she earned at the flower shop. Without health insurance or substantial savings, she saw no immediate solution. That same night, she lay beside her mother until she fell asleep, mentally going over possible strategies, taking out a loan, working extra hours, selling what few belongings she had. Nothing seemed enough. The next day, as Seo-yeon tried to focus on a new floral arrangement, Min-jun walked into the shop with hesitant steps. He often stopped by to chat, or to buy flowers he offered in his father's memory, saying he felt at peace surrounded by natural scents. Yet the moment he entered, he sensed a distress in Seo-yeon that even her usual resolve could not hide. Approaching her, he softly asked if everything was all right. Eyes brimming with tears, Seo-yeon apologized for not being able to serve him right away, and excused herself to step into the small back storeroom, where her sadness and anxiety momentarily overwhelmed her. Min-jun followed, concerned. In a comforting gesture, he took her hand and asked if she needed help. That was when Seo-yeon, pushed to her limit, decided to tell him the truth. Her mother needed urgent surgery. As she shared her story, Min-jun listened silently. Though moved, he tried not to interrupt, letting her vent. Once she finished, he told her, with a mix of empathy and assurance, that he had the financial means to cover the procedure. He knew it was a delicate offer. He didn't want to embarrass her or hurt her pride, but neither could he stand by while she was suffering. Seo-yeon's reaction was a mix of relief, shame, and mistrust. While Min-jun's proposal gave her a chance to save her mother's life, she worried people would see it merely as an act of charity. Moreover, she was concerned about how it might look to his family and the company employees, a humble girl seeking a financial windfall. She could still recall the cold reception some of Min-jun's colleagues had given her when they met at Don Manuel's memorial. She didn't want to be singled out or judged as an opportunist. So, Her voice trembling, she turned down his offer, though she did so gratefully. Taken aback, Minjun insisted that this was not about pity. He simply cared about Sunja's well-being and wanted to help, but Seo-yeon remained firm, uncertain whether she was doing the right thing. Meanwhile, the situation at the construction company was growing more complicated in Minjun's absence from key matters. His sister, Na-yeon, and his uncle, Sang-min, proceeded with increasing audacity on the plan they were devising behind the new heir's back. They seized every opportunity to explore merger proposals with rival firms, aiming to sell shares and pocket exorbitant sums. Both craved broader control without Minjun's awareness of the legal and financial repercussions. They had the silent support of a couple of executives who had their own vested interests in the arrangement. They knew that as long as Minjun was distracted by personal worries or the tensions stemming from his father's legacy, they could operate unhindered. At the company offices, Na-yeon and Sang-min held a meeting with a stern-looking man, representing an investment group that had always clashed with Don Manuel. The three of them discussed the merger details, agreeing on favorable terms for Na-yeon and her uncle. Subtly, they slipped in clauses that would allow them to acquire strategic assets at a reduced price, something that, in the long run, would put Minjun's company in check. To ensure fertile ground for their plans to grow undetected, Na-yeon began spreading malicious rumors about her brother's closeness with a humble girl. With a falsely sympathetic smile, she claimed that this young woman was manipulating him into giving her money for her mother's benefit. Her strategy was to plant doubt among directors and shareholders, so that any proposal from Minjun at the next meeting would be met with distrust. For her part, Seo-yeon was under mounting pressure. On one hand, each time Minjun dropped by the flower shop or invited her for coffee, she felt more connected to him. A gentle affection had sprung up between them, allowing them to share their most personal stories. Sometimes, at the end of the day, they would stroll together through the neighborhood, and he would walk her home to make sure she was safe. During these walks, she told him childhood tales about how Sunja had always done everything possible to protect her. Touched, Minjun also opened his heart, describing how hard it had been to grow up under the weight of a powerful family name and the shadow of a father with high expectations. These were moments of closeness that astonished them both. Seo-yeon discovered in Minjun not the arrogant man people assumed, but someone searching for his own path, someone who wrestled with doubts and emotions. Minjun, in turn, marveled at Seo-yeon's courage, her ability to hold together a household stripped of luxuries while still clinging to hope. With every confidence shared, their bond deepened, but so did Seo-yeon's unease. She kept delaying the decision to accept the urgent help she needed. Time was running out, and her mother's health was visibly declining. One afternoon, as Seo-yeon was saying goodbye to Minjun at her doorstep, Sunja emerged to greet him. Though weak, she smiled warmly and thanked him for accompanying her daughter. Seeing him up close, she noticed the sincerity in his eyes and felt a desperate urge to beg him to convince Seo-yeon to accept the money for the surgery. Still, she chose not to interfere. She understood her daughter's pride, while also fearing that financial need might taint what had clearly become a bond full of mutual admiration. Soon after, in a corridor at the construction company, Na-yeon took it upon herself to drop poisonous comments among certain executives. She spoke of Minjun's supposed relationship with a flower seller who, in her telling, was luring him in with false promises of love. She claimed the young woman needed money for an expensive medical treatment and was conveniently taking advantage of the family fortune. She stressed that Minjun was too emotional after Don Manuel's passing to see who genuinely cared for him. With every insinuation, Na-yeon stirred up more suspicious glances, creating a perfect breeding ground for undermining her brother's credibility in future decisions. Sang-min, for his part, backed her plan by producing altered financial statements that showed inflated expenses on flowers and donations, hinting that Minjun was neglecting the company's finances. Everything was done discreetly, never quite exploding into public view, but carefully laying the groundwork for suspicion. Na-yeon reveled in the thought of how potent this manipulation would be when the time came to expose the truth to shareholders and family members. Meanwhile, Seo-yeon wrestled with her conscience. Each time Minjun offered to lend her the money, she dodged the suggestion with vague excuses. She didn't want to appear self-serving, or worse, betray whatever was growing between them. To her, her mother's dignity and her own were priceless. Yet every time she came home from work to find Sunja looking even paler, her resolve wavered. Might her stubbornness only make things worse? She began to wonder if it would be so terrible to accept the help of someone who, at heart asked for nothing in return. Minjun was no longer just a customer, but a person she connected with deeply. One night, after an especially grueling day at the flower shop, Seo-yeon stayed curled up beside her mother until the early hours. Seeing that the fever would not subside, she decided to call the hospital so they could examine her. Soon-ja was admitted for a few hours while her condition was stabilized, and the scare was overwhelming for Seo-yeon, who spent every minute praying in the waiting room. The moment Minjun heard what had happened, he went straight to the hospital, leaving numerous pending issues at the construction company. He found Seo-yeon in a corner, her hands clenched and her eyes locked on a closed door. Without a word, he sat beside her and held her hand. In that silent closeness, more emotions were expressed than in any of their previous conversations. During those hours of distress, Seo-yeon seriously considered accepting Minjun's offer once and for all, yet she still couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. Not even the possibility of a tragic outcome broke her resistance. She convinced herself that once her mother woke, they would decide together what to do. But that short delay proved critical. By then, Na-yeon had already spread her twisted version of events through various corners of the company. Some employees and executives were whispering that the girl from the neighborhood was responsible for distracting Minjun and might even be draining the construction company's resources. By late afternoon, when Soon-ja showed signs of improvement and the doctor allowed her to go home to continue treatment, Seo-yeon and Minjun walked toward the hospital exit. Tired but relieved, he reiterated his willingness to cover the cost of the surgery. Seo-yeon merely thanked him and promised to think more seriously about it. She hugged him before he left, feeling the warmth of a man who did not judge her but longed to protect her. It was an intimate moment in which they held each other, both aware that something profound connected them. Night was falling over the city when, in a quiet office at the construction company, Na-yeon made her final phone call of the day. She spoke with one of the key directors, confirming that everything was going according to plan and that the rumors were beginning to take root. After hanging up, she smiled with the satisfaction of someone weaving a complex web. Minjun's trust in Seo-yeon was the weak spot they needed, and soon they would reap the benefits of that intrigue. Word that Seo-yeon was after the family's money to pay for her mother's operation spread in a matter of hours, planting the seed of distrust. Though Minjun was still unaware, the net woven by his enemies was tightening around him, ready to exploit any hint of doubt or fear to break the budding love he shared with Seo-yeon. The business event was held in an exclusive city venue, a place adorned with luxurious crystal chandeliers and a gleaming marble floor reflecting golden lights from the ceiling. A select group of partners, executives, and directors of the construction company gathered there to celebrate the firm's recent achievements, assuming that Minjun, as the new leader, would be present to preside over the occasion. Na-yeon and Sang-min, always vigilant, made sure to invite Seo-yeon, claiming it would be a good opportunity for her to get familiar with Minjun's professional circle. Seo-yeon hesitated to accept, uncomfortable with high society events, but Na-yeon's insistence and Minjun's own interest convinced her. That night, Seo-yeon arrived wearing a simple dress that betrayed her humble origins, yet she carried herself with dignity in each step she took. The moment Seo-yeon crossed the threshold, curious eyes settled on her. She immediately sensed the vast divide between this world and her own. Some guests ignored her entirely, absorbed in their own conversations, while others eyed her with disdain, scrutinizing her attire and mannerisms to confirm she did not belong. She moved forward feeling more closely watched than ever in her life. Even so, she kept her back straight, recalling her mother's encouraging words. Dignity did not depend on clothes or wealth, but on how one treated others. So, Seo-yeon smiled kindly, attempting to still the slight trembling of her hands. Minjun, deep in conversation with investors, took a few minutes to notice Seo-yeon's arrival. When he finally saw her standing by the stairs, his expression lit up with surprise and delight. He excused himself from his companions and walked toward her, taking her hand in a gesture meant to welcome her. Seo-yeon felt a bit calmer, recognizing in his gaze the warmth he showed her in private. Yet hardly had they exchanged a few words when several partners approached to vie for Minjun's attention. It seemed everyone wanted his approval or a moment of his time. He asked Seo-yeon to wait for him, promising he would be back soon to introduce her officially. From a short distance, Na-yeon observed the scene with calculated coolness. She began chatting with a group of high society women, hinting that Seo-yeon was Minjun's new companion. yet suggesting the girl's chief motive was obtaining resources for her sick mother. One of those ladies exclaimed with exaggerated compassion that it was so noble of Min-jun to want to help someone with financial struggles. Another bluntly remarked that it was suspicious how suddenly a humble flower seller had shown up at such an upscale event. Disdainful glances and muffled laughter spread among the group. With each retelling, the story grew more hurtful, portraying Seo-yeon as someone taking advantage of Min-jun's generosity to pay for Soonja's operation. When Min-jun, now freed from his initial obligations, led Seo-yeon toward a group of executives to introduce her, she immediately perceived the undercurrent of prejudice. The men greeted her coolly, as though she were unworthy of their attention. The women scanned her from head to toe, their expressions ranging from pity to scorn. Trying to compose herself, Seo-yeon responded with courtesy and shaky smiles, struggling to keep her words from sticking in her throat. Min-jun sensed something amiss in the way the others received her, though he didn't yet grasp the extent of the rumor spreading around. Even so, the tension in the air was undeniable. Suddenly, one of the most influential partners, a close friend of Min-jun's family, made an offensive remark in front of everyone, asking if the girl had any idea how expensive that venue was, or if she thought a single night of good luck would solve all her problems. The barb landed like a blow to Seo-yeon's gut. Stunned, she tried to respond calmly, but her voice faltered. Min-jun stared in shock, unsure how to react at once. That remark stirred up a painful memory. An ex-girlfriend who once sought only the family's money and then left Min-jun when she discovered Don Manuel planned to limit his fortune. That unfinished story flashed through his mind, and he found himself looking at Seo-yeon with the first flicker of doubt. Sensing Min-jun's uncertainty, Na-yeon seized the moment to sow more discord. She approached him with feigned concern, whispering the rumors everyone was circulating, that the girl might be using her family's situation as an excuse to insert herself into the family and reap benefits. She also dropped information about Soonja's escalating medical bills, suggesting that Seo-yeon had openly flaunted Min-jun's assistance. All this, alongside the guest's hostile attitude, began to cloud his judgment. For the first time, Seo-yeon's words tangled with the memories of betrayal he had long buried. Left alone, trying to dodge the poisonous comments, Seo-yeon looked up to see Min-jun returning with a distrustful look, demanding to speak with her in private. He guided her to a corner of the hall, away from most of the whispers. In a quiet but tense voice, he asked if everything being said about her was true. Was she really using him to pay for her mother's operation? Were her attentions merely a means to secure funding? Seo-yeon opened her eyes wide, stunned by the accusation. Her trembling voice explained that she had never wanted to accept his money, precisely to avoid such talk. Yet he, swayed by old memories and Na-yeon's manipulations, remained unconvinced. That old wound tore open with force, and Min-jun hurled words that hurt her deeply. In the middle of the party, with onlookers paying keen attention, Min-jun spoke sentences he would regret the moment they left his lips. He said that if Seo-yeon needed money so badly, she should have been honest from the start instead of feigning an affection that might never have existed. Pained, he compared her to people who had used him in the past. Seo-yeon's composure collapsed. Her face burned with a mix of indignation and despair. Unable to hold back her tears, she took a step away and reminded him, her voice broken, that she had always refused his help, that she never approached him for his status, but for the genuine affection that had grown between them. The harm was done. Several guests started whispering, watching the confrontation unfold before their eyes. From afar, Na-yeon and Sangmin exchanged looks of satisfaction. The rumor had achieved its intended effect. Min-jun, blinded by anger, was humiliating Seo-yeon in front of everyone. Deeply hurt and unable to defend herself amid such judgment, she pushed through the crowd and ran out of the hall, tears in her eyes, feeling betrayed by someone she had truly started to love. The next day, Min-jun locked himself in his office, his throat tight and his heart in pieces. He couldn't focus on company affairs, not even on the documents that Na-yeon and Sangmin kept pushing in front of him. They pressed him to review papers related to a strategic merger. Overwhelmed, he barely glanced at them and ended up signing a few pages without realizing that one set of documents contained clauses critically endangering the company's assets. Na-yeon excused her rush by saying they had to move quickly or risk losing a multi-million-dollar opportunity. Thus, Min-jun stayed distracted, stewing in anger over what had happened with Seo-yeon, and failed to see the deception. As for Seo-yeon, Despite everything, she couldn't completely sever her bond with Min-jun. Her mother required constant care, and the hospital's bureaucracy was wearing her down day by day. Though still hurt by his words, she felt compelled to keep some contact, as she saw no other way to handle the mounting bills. Yet she decided she would never again beg for his financial support. She limited herself to brief updates on Sunja's condition, hoping that at some point Min-jun would backtrack and apologize. Meanwhile, she struggled with her own resentment and the urgent need to resolve her mother's situation. A couple of days later, Seo-yeon went to the construction company to drop off an envelope containing medical reports that needed to be submitted along with the hospital invoices. She had no intention of meeting with him directly. She only planned to hand it over at reception and leave. However, as she walked down the hallway toward the office, she noticed the door was slightly ajar and heard voices discussing important contracts. Driven by curiosity and a sense that something was amiss, she drew closer and recognized Na-yeon and Sang-min. Peering in, she glimpsed a document mentioning the sale of a substantial portion of the company. Seo-yeon's eyes widened as she realized that the information implied near-total embezzlement. With the envelope of invoices in hand, Seo-yeon stood frozen, unsure whether to step in and warn Min-jun about the trap about to snap shut. She remembered the cruel words he had hurled at her, replaying the humiliation she'd endured in front of everyone at the event. A surge of anger and mistrust washed over her. Why should she help him when he had accused her of opportunism before his friends and colleagues? Yet her conscience battled her bitterness. She knew Min-jun was being manipulated. She foresaw that if no one warned him in time, the man she still loved, in spite of everything, would lose his father's legacy. For several seconds, she wavered between leaving without looking back or stepping in to confront them. In the end, her legs trembled and she decided to retreat, clutching the envelope of medical documents to her chest. She left the construction company with her mind in turmoil. On one hand, she felt the need to protect her dignity and keep her distance from a family that had ridiculed her. On the other, she recognized the risk Min-jun was facing if he continued signing papers without pausing to analyze them, especially while he remained mired in confusion. She walked along the sidewalk for quite some time, clutching the envelope tightly, as though its contents were the only certainty she had at that moment. The streets stretched out before her, filled with anonymous footsteps, as she asked herself if it was worth warning someone who had hurt her so deeply. She let out a long sigh and forced herself to keep moving, gaze fixed on the horizon, aware that sooner or later she would have to make a definitive decision. Seo-yeon spent a sleepless night trying to process what she had discovered about Na-yeon and Sang-min. She couldn't shake the image of those documents mentioning the near-total sale of the construction company, nor the realization that the two of them were behind the rumors that had caused her so much pain. From time to time, she would try to close her eyes and rest, but she kept startling awake, recalling how they had looked at her with feigned cordiality, how Na-yeon had pretended concern for her mother, and how they had exploited Min-jun's mistrust. Remorse and confusion kept her awake until dawn, her thoughts revolving around the idea of doing something to expose them before it was too late. Early the next morning, Seo-yeon consulted Sunja, who, despite her fragile health, grasped the gravity of the situation. Her mother advised her to act calmly and, above all, to seek out the one person in Min-jun's family who had both the heart to listen and the authority to set things right: Young-suk, Don Manuel's widow. Seo-yeon believed that if Young-suk learned the truth, she would know how to proceed. After all, the matriarch had been married to a man who had left her an entire company and who was, by all accounts, a firm believer in honesty. Seo-yeon understood that going directly to Min-jun would be useless right now. He was still consumed by anger and doubt and would likely refuse to hear her explanations. Besides, she needed solid evidence and the word of a family member to dismantle the lies told about her. With that resolve, Seo-yeon asked for time off from the flower shop and headed to Young-suk's home. She rang the bell with a knot in her stomach, fearing the woman might reject her upon recognizing her as the girl supposedly responsible for so much trouble. However, a household employee opened the door and led her to the main sitting room, merely showing mild surprise at her appearance. Seo-yeon waited a few minutes on a large sofa adorned with subtly colored cushions, her eyes drifting to the family portraits on the walls. In one, she saw a smiling young Min-jun seated on Don Manuel's lap. The painting reflected a family warmth she herself had never experienced in that world of luxury. Young-suk appeared after a while, dressed in a simple skirt and blouse ensemble that showed her natural elegance. She observed Seo-yeon with a probing look, trying to gauge whether all that she had heard about her was true. But upon seeing the young woman's anguished expression and reddened eyes, her own features softened, and she invited Seo-yeon to speak openly. Taking a moment to steady her breathing, Seo-yeon began her account. She explained how she had met Min-jun, the early misunderstandings, and the growing closeness between them. She also described her mother's illness and the moral dilemma that tormented her when Min-jun offered financial help. Then, her voice trembling, she produced a copy of the draft contract referring to the imminent sale of major company assets. Young-suk listened carefully without interrupting, each of Seo-yeon's words painting a far more complex scenario than she had imagined. Upon seeing the folder containing the proposed merger clauses, she immediately recognized Min-jun's signature and Sang-min's on certain sections. She also noticed that Na-yeon had initialed some pages. It was then she realized this was no mere rumor, but a genuine plot to dispossess her son of the construction company Don Manuel had worked so hard to build. Seo-yeon pointed out the most suspicious clauses and described the manipulation carried out by Na-yeon and Sang-min, who had concocted a false story about her intentions toward Min-jun, fueling everyone's mistrust. Young-suk's expression shifted from disbelief to indignation and then to determination. She stood up and, in a resolute voice, declared that she would summon Min-jun, Na-yeon, and Sang-min to a family meeting at her home that very afternoon. It wasn't the first time she had sensed something amiss in her daughter and brother-in-law's maneuvers, but she had never had such clear evidence as what Seo-yeon was now providing. Without delay, she asked the young woman to remain at the house until Min-jun arrived, explaining that her testimony would be essential to clarifying matters. Feeling supported for the first time since all this began, Seo-yeon nodded gratefully and prepared to wait in an adjacent room so she would not run into Min-jun too soon. A few hours later, the house staff announced the arrival of Na-yeon and Sang-min, followed closely by Min-jun, who looked puzzled by the sudden summons. Young-suk greeted them in the main living room, a spacious area with windows overlooking a meticulously tended garden. The tension in the air was palpable from the start. Na-yeon and Sang-min moved with caution, exchanging furtive glances. Min-jun, for his part, seemed uneasy, clearly not understanding why such an abrupt meeting had been called, yet reluctant to question his mother's authority in her own home. Once everyone was gathered, Young-suk raised her voice and explained that she had obtained documents revealing very serious irregularities in the management of the construction company. Sang-min reacted with a slight flush and a nervous flutter of his eyelids, while Na-yeon frowned in an attempt to seem incredulous at such insinuations. A visibly concerned Min-jun demanded more details, alarmed by his mother's words. That was the moment Seo-yeon emerged from her waiting spot and approached slowly, the folder of evidence in her hands. She noticed how Min-jun looked at her with a mix of shock and lingering resentment, but she summoned the courage to meet his gaze. She began by describing the manipulation occurring within the company. Seo-yeon displayed the draft contract, highlighting that it involved the sale of almost all the firm's critical assets under misleading terms that, in the long run, would spell ruin for the family. Young-suk corroborated her claims, explaining that she herself had reviewed the data and confirmed its authenticity. Na-yeon and Sang-min hurried to defend the document, insisting it was only a preliminary merger agreement and that they had intended to inform the family once the details were finalized. Yet the signatures and the clauses revealed a coordinated scheme to take control of the company behind Min-jun's back. Tension mounted further when Seo-yeon pointed out that Na-yeon and Sang-min had also been responsible for spreading rumors about her supposed interest in Min-jun's money. Her voice cracked with emotion as she insisted she had never sought to profit from his fortune, and, in fact, had repeatedly refused his help precisely to avoid that kind of judgment. Cornered, Na-yeon tried to fight back, claiming she had only been protecting her brother from someone she felt was after him for personal gain. But Young-suk refused to allow that accusation to stand. She stated that Seo-yeon's testimony and the supporting evidence made it perfectly clear who had orchestrated the smear campaign. Min-jun listened in silence, first stunned, then with a fury, evident in the trembling of his hands. He ran his palm over his hair, hardly believing that his own sister and uncle had concocted such a deception. He realized that his personal history, his old wound from the ex-girlfriend who had only been after the family's money, had been the weak spot Na-yeon and Sang-min exploited to sway him. A wave of anger and pain coursed through him, driving home how unjustly he had treated Seo-yeon. Clenching his fists and fixing his eyes on Sang-min, he demanded the truth. Cornered, his uncle partially admitted his role, claiming it was a good deal, and that Min-jun had been absent from crucial company matters anyway. Na-yeon could barely hide her nervousness, confirming all suspicions. Suddenly, the accusations flew. Min-jun shouted that they had betrayed Don Manuel's legacy, while Young-suk clung to the hope that, with this evidence, the company could be saved from a total sale. Driven into a corner, Sang-min confessed they had aimed to secure a huge personal profit concealed within the merger, planning to keep Min-jun as a public figurehead while they pulled the financial strings. Na-yeon lowered her head in silence, finding no excuse to deny the now exposed truth. Amid the chaos, Min-jun turned to Seo-yeon with guilt in his eyes. Approaching her, he tried to take her hands, asking forgiveness for doubting her intentions and for humiliating her at the party. His voice wavered as he admitted how easily he had fallen for his family's ploy because he feared reliving a past betrayal. Seo-yeon listened, her gaze unflinching, though her eyes held the weight of her pain. She understood that Min-jun's anger now was not directed at her, but at those who had deceived him. Yet she also knew nothing could erase the public humiliation she had endured, or the scornful looks that had come her way. When he finished speaking, Seo-yeon slowly withdrew her hands and folded them across her chest. Although Min-jun's words sounded sincere, the recent wound still throbbed inside her. In a gentle yet firm tone, she told him she couldn't forgive him immediately, for words alone were not enough. She needed time to heal, time to think about the dynamic that had been created between them and how easily trust had vanished at the first malicious suggestion. Min-jun lowered his head, accepting that his actions had had consequences that could not be undone so easily. His rage toward Na-yeon and Sang-min merged with the shame of having hurt someone he now realized he genuinely loved. Resolute in her desire to protect her son and restore the family's honor, Young-suk announced she would consult with the lawyers to take immediate action against those involved in the deceitful merger. Na-yeon and Sang-min realized that, with the newfound information and documentation, it would be difficult to evade legal scrutiny. While the discussion continued, Seo-yeon made her way to the door. She felt she had done what she must, revealed the truth, defended Don Manuel's legacy, and, in a way, reclaimed the dignity of her own story. Before crossing the threshold, Seo-yeon cast one last look at Min-jun, who watched her with a helpless expression, wishing he could stop her. She conveyed to him with a slight shake of her head that it wasn't the time to follow her. She left the house with a heavy heart, aware that what had just happened marked a clear before and after, not only for the family, but also for her own life. Outside, the afternoon sky was streaked with reds and oranges, colors that seemed to predict a murky end for Na-yeon and Sang-min's schemes, while also hinting at the possibility of a new beginning, one that was still uncertain. Min-jun remained standing in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the documents that proved everything, with Young-suk at his side and the image of Seo-yeon etched in his mind. He realized that his insecurities had been his family's strongest weapon to manipulate him and push him away from the only person who had truly cared about him. He swallowed hard, aware that a complicated period was approaching, not only to defend the company, but also to rebuild the trust and affection of the person who had just left, carrying the hurt he himself had caused. As silence took hold of the house, Seo-yeon's final words echoed within him, along with the sense that the distance between them now would not be bridged easily. The hospital was bustling that midday, with doctors and nurses rushing through the halls while patients and family members waited in the lobby. Seo-yeon arrived almost breathless, filled with uncertainty about whether she could finally admit her mother for the long-awaited operation. Several days had passed since the truth came to light at Young-suk's home, and in that time, the hospital bills had not gone down. Her only solace was knowing that Na-yeon and Sang-min would face consequences for their actions, and that Min-jun, upon discovering everything, was prepared to reverse the disadvantageous merger. Even so, Seo-yeon had kept her distance, focusing primarily on Soonja's health, never imagining the surprise she was about to receive. When she approached the admissions desk to confirm the operation date, the receptionist regarded her kindly and informed her that the expenses had been covered by a foundation with an unfamiliar name. At first, Seo-yeon didn't understand. She had spent weeks trying to arrange a loan or find some way to pay the costs, without success. The employee explained that, out of the blue, the hospital management had received a donation sufficient to cover both the procedure and post-op care. Seo-yeon stood there frozen, unable to believe the good news. Though there was no direct proof, Her instincts whispered that Min-jun was behind this anonymous assistance. With all the formalities in order, the doctors scheduled Soonja's operation for the next day. Seo-yeon spent that night in her mother's room, attempting to convey calm and confidence. She watched the monitors, feeling her entire life converge on that moment. Even with the relief of knowing the surgery would happen, she still tasted the bitterness of her recent encounters with Min-jun. The image of him asking her forgiveness in a trembling voice dominated her thoughts, yet the wound remained, and regret alone wasn't enough to heal it. Still, deep down, she acknowledged the sincerity behind Min-jun's words and knew that, despite everything, she still cared for him. The morning of the operation rushed by. The doctors transferred Soonja to the operating room while Seo-yeon stayed in the waiting area, searching for the composure to endure the endless hours ahead. She reflected on the incredible generosity of the foundation that had covered the expenses, an amount far greater than what she could have gathered on her own. Simply imagining Min-jun pulling strings quietly sent shivers through her, but it also rekindled the pain of realizing he had not believed her until the end. Unable to sit still, she got up and walked the corridor, the echo of her footsteps mirroring the impatience of each passing second. When the surgeon emerged from the operating room, Seo-yeon felt her heart stop for an instant. The doctors looked serious, but she caught a hint of approval in one of their gazes, which calmed her nerves. The operation had gone well, and Soonja's recovery looked promising, provided she followed the post-op guidelines. A choked sigh escaped Seo-yeon, and she didn't know whether to collapse to her knees or cry out in thanks. She kept telling herself that all the sacrifice, all the humiliation and pain from the rumors had been worth it if it meant saving the life of the person she loved most in the world. Meanwhile, at the construction company, events had taken a dramatic turn. A team of lawyers worked hand-in-hand with Young-suk and Min-jun to stop the harmful merger that Na-yeon and Sang-min had nearly finalized. The misleading clauses and the smear campaign against Seo-yeon were laid bare, leading to the immediate dismissal of both from their company positions. The formal charges were still in progress, and although Na-yeon defended herself by claiming she had only wanted to protect her brother, the evidence was overwhelming. Sang-min, cornered, chose to admit his role in the fraudulent act, hoping to lessen potential penalties. With his family torn apart and his trust shattered, Min-jun was resolute in restoring Don Manuel's legacy with transparency and dedication. He spent countless hours reviewing documents and overseeing every aspect of operations, determined to prevent a repeat of such a betrayal. His mother joined him in these work sessions, offering support from the sidelines as he took on the leadership he had always feared. That resolve led him to establish, almost simultaneously, a charitable organization in his father's name, whose main goal would be to cover medical costs for underprivileged patients. He thought it the most fitting way to honor Don Manuel's memory and, in some measure, atone for his mistake with Seo-yeon. He hoped that someday she would understand the intent behind the gesture. Once the company's most urgent conflicts were on track, Min-jun learned that Soonja's surgery had been successful. He chose not to go to the hospital right away, worried his presence might cause Seo-yeon more pain. Even so, he discreetly sent flowers and a message with well wishes, leaving the note unsigned. When Seo-yeon received the bouquet, she couldn't suppress a wave of tenderness. She wondered whether Min-jun had begun making amends in this quiet way. However, she put aside any thoughts of her feelings until she was certain her mother was truly out of danger. The days that followed tested Seo-yeon's patience and resolve as she looked after her recovering mother. Despite the financial support covering treatments, the convalescents demanded constant care, precise medication, and strict rest. Seo-yeon never left her mother's side, nor did she neglect her job at the flower shop, where her boss kindly accommodated her absences. During those sleepless nights, she heard a rumor, soon confirmed. The foundation that had covered the medical costs bore Don Manuel's name, and its main benefactor was Min-jun. Upon learning the full story, Seo-yeon felt a mixture of relief and emotion. She understood that her mother owed her life in large part to the discreet intervention of the man who had once hurt her, yet whose actions now proved his sincerity. The day Soonja was discharged, Seo-yeon brought her home, promising complete rest and frequent doctor visits for checkups. She felt slightly lighter, as if the weight she had carried for so long was finally lifting. That same afternoon, while adjusting her mother's bedsheets and offering her a warm cup of tea, Seo-yeon received an unexpected phone call. It was Min-jun. She remained silent for a few moments before answering. her heart pounding. She listened to his somewhat hesitant voice telling her he wanted to talk, with no pressure, whenever she felt ready. She couldn't find words right away, but she quietly agreed, arranging a meeting at the flower shop the following day. The next morning was cool and clear when Seo-yeon arrived at the flower shop for her shift. She was nervous, almost as if it were the first day she had met Min-jun. The scent of carnations and roses mingling with the early sunlight reminded her of a time when life wasn't so complicated. She busied herself checking the flowers on the shelves, trying to keep her mind off things, until she saw him step through the door. Min-jun was dressed simply, nothing reminiscent of his formerly imposing, executive style. It was as though he wanted to show her, through that simplicity, that everything had changed. They approached each other with caution. No hugs, no overly emotional gestures, but no resentment either. He began by asking how Seunja was doing, and Seo-yeon, in a soft voice, told him that she was recovering well. At one point, Min-jun confessed that for days he had longed to explain why he'd helped her anonymously. He admitted he wanted no public credit for it, nor was he trying to buy her forgiveness. Rather, he had finally realized that saving her mother's life had to be his priority, regardless of the rift between them. He wanted to make amends for having hurt her at her most vulnerable, for not trusting her when she needed support the most. Seo-yeon felt tears pressing behind her eyes. Memories of sleepless nights, humiliation, the rejection at the party, and the wound that had been so slow to heal all flooded back. Yet she also felt Min-jun's sincerity and recognized how his actions backed up every word he spoke. She decided to hear him out and consider his request for a second chance. He confessed he missed her, that he longed to start over, free of ghosts and rumors, and with the lesson learned never to let old insecurities cloud his judgment again. At first, Seo-yeon feared her own feelings might betray her, but then she understood that she still held affection for this man in her heart. Looking him in the eyes, she made it clear that nothing would return to how it had been right away. Broken trust could not be repaired in an instant. However, she also acknowledged that she wanted to believe in him, especially after seeing what he had done for Seunja and for the company. With a tentative smile, she told him they could move forward slowly, carefully, and focus on building something genuine, far removed from the manipulations that had caused them so much harm. From that moment on, they began discussing the idea of working together on the new foundation Min-jun had founded in Don Manuel's honor. Seo-yeon, with her empathy and understanding of the needs of those less fortunate, offered valuable guidance on how to distribute medical resources to those who needed them most. Min-jun, meanwhile, took care of the finances and the connections necessary to secure donations and partner with hospitals. Gradually, this shared project became a bridge that shortened the distance between their worlds, reminding them of what had brought them together in the first place: empathy, solidarity, and a genuine desire to be there for each other in difficult times. The afternoon when Seunja left the hospital for a checkup and ended up strolling through a small nearby garden, Seo-yeon ran into Min-jun there. She held her mother's hand, helping her take slow steps, while he brought over a wheelchair in case she got tired. In a gentle voice, Seunja thanked them both for their dedication and effort, so her life wouldn't be cut short by her illness. She watched how they looked at each other, noticing the tenderness in their eyes. Although there were still unresolved issues and scars yet to heal, the seed of reconciliation bloomed under the sunset's warm glow. At that moment, Seo-yeon turned toward Min-jun and quietly clasped his hand. It was a simple gesture, yet filled with promises. He returned her smile and dared to wrap an arm around her shoulders, respecting her pace, knowing each step must be built on renewed trust. Together, they watched Seunja settle onto a bench beneath a tree's shade, enjoying the scent of the plants and the fresh breeze. A discreet ray of sunlight lit up the family ring Min-jun wore, passed down from Don Manuel, reminding them that this legacy was now more than just a symbol of wealth. It was a bridge for helping others and rewriting their story. In that humble garden, the three of them found a brief moment of peace, as though the world had shrunk to that scene brimming with hope. Seo-yeon felt that she had finally found a place in Min-jun's universe, and that he, in turn, had learned to open his heart to life's simple joys. They melted into a sincere embrace, aware that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be worthwhile. From that day on, the new foundation would take shape, and through it they would help many families who, like Seo-yeon and Seunja, struggled with the anguish of not having the medical resources they needed. Orange-tinged clouds in the twilight sky seemed to bless that moment. Moved, Minjun kissed Seoyeon's forehead, and she gazed at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. A soft breeze shook the garden's flowers, and in that whisper it felt as though a pact was sealed. Both were ready to start over without lies or resentment. After all, family is not just formed by blood ties, but by a shared will to care for one another and grow together. And so, with Sunja resting among flowers and the promise of a fuller life, Seoyeon and Minjun came together in a simple vow of love, a genuine symbol of the union of two worlds that once had seemed impossible to reconcile. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for joining us on this journey, filled with emotion, intrigue, and redemption. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe, leave your like, and share it with those who love stories of love overcoming any obstacle. We'll see you in the next adventure, where we'll continue exploring the deepest emotions of the heart. Take care, and see you soon.